Hello, friends. I'm Eric Hutchinson. I'm the principal broker and owner of Hutchinson Realty. Welcome to video 11 of my video series, How to Buy a Home in Northwest Arkansas. I hope that you will go back and watch some of the other videos in the series because we have talked about a lot of interesting topics. We've been working our way through the Arkansas real estate contract as I explain how to buy a home in Northwest Arkansas. Today, we are talking about a really interesting topic. We're going to be talking about the seller's disclosure. What is the seller's disclosure? Well, look at the three houses behind me. Each of these three houses are similar in shape and size, and maybe were even built by the same builder, but they all have different owners and they all have different histories. One may have a leaky roof, and maybe they fixed the roof, maybe they didn't. One may have mold in the property. The other one may have had water intrusion, but the seller has fixed it. Would you want to know if there was something wrong with the property in the past that maybe they have covered up? Those are reasons to get a seller's disclosure. But how do we do that? How do we ask for that? I'm so glad you asked. That is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to look at the real estate contract and we're going to be looking at the seller's disclosure. So let's get into it, shall we? I'm going to go to page 8 of the Arkansas real estate contract. And this is item number 18. This is where we ask for the seller's disclosure, or we decide we don't want a seller's disclosure. So letter A says that there is a seller's disclosure already filled out by the seller, and you've already seen it before you get to the contract. And many times that's the case, but that's not always the case. And I would say that probably more times than not, the buyer says, hey, I love this house, let's make an offer. And then the buyer says, hey, I'd kind of like to get a seller's disclosure. And that's when you would check letter B. And so in letter B on this, it says that the buyer would like the seller to fill out a seller's disclosure or at least provide a seller's disclosure. And then the buyer has 3 days, business days, to determine whether or not that seller's disclosure is acceptable or not. So even if the seller accepts your offer, you've got a 3-day contingency on whether or not you want to buy the property based upon the seller's disclosure. And many times the agent will check this if the buyer has not seen the seller's disclosure yet. Letter C says, although a seller's disclosure may have been completed by the seller, the buyer neither wants one and is not requesting one. Now, why do you think that a buyer would not want to request a seller's disclosure? I mean, don't you want to know the history of the property? Well, many times we get investors that want to buy a property and they either want to flip it or they want to rent it out to someone else. If there is something that is disclosed to them, then they have to turn right around and disclose that to the next person. And so sometimes when people are buying the property as an investment or they are planning on remodeling it or doing some kind of renovation, they just would rather not know. And so there's an option C that says that even though a seller's disclosure may have been filled out, the buyer doesn't want one. Now, letter D says there is no seller's disclosure. Now, we see this a lot in bank-owned properties or where the bank has repossessed the property, they don't know anything about it, or if a husband and wife have passed away and the children have got the home in an estate, then sometimes they know nothing about the history of the property. They didn't live there. Their parents didn't tell them anything. They don't know anything. And so they just don't provide a seller's disclosure. Many people don't realize this, but it's not the law that the seller provide a seller's disclosure. They don't have to provide a written disclosure about the property. It is not something that the law requires. And so many times if the seller doesn't know anything about the property, if it's the kids that are selling it, then they just don't fill one out, or if it's a bank-owned property. So those are the options that we have on page 8 on item number 18 on seller's disclosure. But let's go take a look at the actual seller's disclosure. Now, at my office, we always recommend to the seller that they fill this out because this can help them in the future. Anything they disclose, the buyer can't legitimately sue them for because they've disclosed it and the buyer signs this disclosure. And so I would highly recommend that if you are a seller, to fill out one of these seller's disclosure. Look at all the questions that are over here to my left and the left-hand side of the screen here. You can see that there are lots of questions. Now this is I'm just going to show you 2 pages. There's so many questions to ask, and they're very good. And the seller would answer yes, no, unknown, or not applicable. Let's look at item number 4. Item number 4 on this page says, to your knowledge, has any person or entity ever refused to complete the purchase of the property because of an actual or alleged problem with the property? So let's say that a buyer did a home inspection and they found something really wrong with the property, said, hey, I'm backing out of the deal. According to this, the seller should disclose that to the next buyer. So if you're the next buyer, wouldn't you want to know that a buyer before you decided to not buy the property for whatever reason? Wouldn't you want to know that? Most buyers would want to know that. And again, that's just one question. Item number 5 says, to your knowledge, is there any features of the property shared in common, such as fences or walls or driveways? Wouldn't you want to know if you shared a driveway with your neighbor? That'd be good information for you. Item number 6 says, to your knowledge, is there a homeowners association? Wouldn't you want to know that there's a homeowner association or not, and you have a monthly or yearly payment to the homeowner association? These are all really good questions. Let's move over to another page in here and look at item number 17. To your knowledge, are there any lawsuits affecting this property? Wouldn't you want to know if there was a lawsuit or a lien or some kind of hidden fee that's in there? This is why we have a seller's disclosure. Item number 18 says, to your knowledge, are there any encroachments or easements or problems with the title? These are all things that you would want to know as a buyer. So you can see how important it is. Now let me move over to page number 13 and 14 of the seller's disclosure. Now, page 13 and 14 are new to our seller's disclosure this year, and it basically says within 3 days after an accepted contract, the seller is going to update the disclosure. If there's been any changes since they first filled it out, they need to list them here, and the seller signs and the buyer signs. So this is really important because sometimes sellers fill out a seller's disclosure maybe months before the house goes on the market, or even if it's taken 2 or 3 months to sell the home, and maybe something has happened, maybe a storm, a hailstorm, or a tornado, or water intrusion, or a leak, or something's happened to the property. Maybe the seller should update the disclosure. That's why they added this page. Page number 14 is to be filled out by the seller or updated by the seller within 3 days before closing. So you got 3 days before, or I'm sorry, 3 days after an accepted contract and 3 days before closing, just because it takes time to close a transaction. And so a lot of times things happen in between. So now we have got 2 different times where the seller will update the seller's disclosure, protecting the buyer against things that may have happened between the first time the seller filled it out and closing. So I hope that makes sense to you. I think the seller's disclosure is really important, and that all buyers probably want to know some of this stuff. Unless you are an investor or planning on flipping the property, you probably want to know the history of the property. So I hope that this information has been helpful to you. Good luck to you and your family as you guys purchase homes, or you are selling your home. If you are selling your home, please fill out a seller's disclosure. It can protect you from liability. You can always reach out to me at info@hutchrealty.com, or you can always go to our website where you can view every listing in Northwest Arkansas and get a free home evaluation. No matter what, may God bless you and may God bless your home.